She wore her uniform with pride. Then police threw her in cuffs until one call changed everything. It started with a breath she didn't know she was holding, a single moment, quiet and small, in a crowd that didn't notice her. But Daniela Rios had learned to make silence her armor. She'd stood still in far worse chaos, under heat, gunfire, sandstorms, and smoke. What she didn't expect was to feel more invisible in her own country than she ever had in a war zone. Downtown buzzed with celebration. It was the 4th of July, flags swayed on storefronts, kids with red, white, blue popsicles ran between parents and food trucks, and speakers blasted distorted versions of the national anthem from corners littered with confetti. America was loud that day. Loud and blind. Daniela walked past a storefront window and saw her own reflection. Her posture straight, her jacket pressed, and a small pin on her chest, the insignia of her old unit. Nothing flashy. Just a symbol of something she gave her 20s to. Something that still lived in her bones. Her steps were measured, her hands steady. But inside, there was the quiet tremble of someone trying to start over. She was on her way to her first interview since discharge. Civilian job. Logistics coordinator. Nothing heroic. Nothing loud. Just a fresh beginning, if the world would let her have it. Then came the voices behind her. Sharp. Commanding. Wrong. Ma'am. Stop right there. Hands where we can see them. She turned slowly, already knowing what was coming. It wasn't the first time, but it never hurt less. 3 police officers. All white. All towering over her with the air of suspicion that never needed evidence. The lead one, a man with mirrored sunglasses and a buzz cut too tight, stepped closer like he was dealing with a threat. His hand hovered near his belt, not on his weapon yet, but close enough to make a statement. "We got a report," he said. "Someone impersonating a federal officer in the area." "That you?" She blinked. "Excuse me. That pin on your chest. Real soldiers don't wear that out here. Not unless they're trying to get something for free." "I served 8 years," Daniela said, voice low but firm. "That pin is real. That service was real." The second officer, younger, maybe mid-20s, tilted his head. "You got ID?" "I do. In my inside pocket." "Don't move." People were starting to notice. Not to help, just to film. Phones out. Eyebrows raised. She saw herself in one of the camera lenses, a woman of color being questioned in public like a criminal for walking and existing and wearing pride on her chest. "You gonna hand over that ID, or not?" the first cop barked. "Only if I can reach for it without being tackled," Daniela said. That's when the third cop stepped forward. No hesitation. Grabbed her wrist. "Wait," she tried. Too late. The metallic click of cuffs echoed louder than the music in the background. Children turned to look. Vendors paused mid-sale. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere, a flag waved. And in the middle of a supposedly free nation, a veteran was shackled like a suspect in broad daylight. "I served this country," she said, barely above a whisper, voice cracking. 8 years. "And you're cuffing me because I look suspicious." No one answered. The phone cameras kept rolling. A few murmurs. But no one stepped forward. "You're not special," the cop muttered. "You people think one little badge makes you untouchable." She didn't flinch. Didn't shout. She just looked at him. Looked through him. And then she said the words that made the moment go quiet. "I served this country for 8 years. And now you're arresting me. Just for being me." The officer froze, but only for a second. It was long enough. Long enough for the young woman holding her phone to realize this wasn't about law enforcement. Long enough for a kid with face paint to ask his mom why the army lady was in handcuffs. Long enough for the air to shift from confusion to something heavier. She stood there, cuffed, alone in a sea of supposed freedom, and then, without raising her voice, without asking for permission, Daniela lifted her chin and said, "Let me make one phone call. Just one." The officer laughed. "You think this is a movie?" "No," she said. "But you're gonna wish it wasn't." The cuffs tightened. Not with violence, but with precision, the kind that said, "We've done this before, we don't need to explain." The lead officer shoved her gently but firmly toward the side of the patrol car, the metal pressing into her spine as her back hit the vehicle. Daniela didn't struggle. She didn't cry. She just stared straight ahead, letting the weight of her silence speak where her voice wouldn't be heard. All around her, phones kept rolling. Little red lights blinking. Eyes full of judgment. People capturing injustice with the same detachment they'd use for fireworks or viral dances. Just another show. The younger female officer stood a few feet away, her brows pinched together, fingers twitching on her belt. She looked like she wanted to say something. Her gaze darted between Daniela and the sergeant, her jaw clenched. But when the lead barked, "Don't just stand there, run her name," she snapped back into compliance like a light switch flipping off. No protest. No pause. Just another voice swallowed by the chain of command. Daniela stood with her cheek pressed against the cold steel of the car, her thoughts slipping into muscle memory. The desert heat. The scent of gunpowder. The sound of boots pounding the dirt. The night she pulled her squad leader from beneath the wreckage while her own leg bled into her boot. The names etched into her memory: Collins, Reyes, Torres, people who had her back, who died with honor. And now here she was, treated like a liar in her own country. Reduced to suspicion because her skin was brown and her posture too proud for someone wearing civilian clothes. A mother passed by with her little boy, maybe 6 years old, holding a cotton candy in one hand and a small flag in the other. The boy slowed when he saw Daniela, his eyes wide, confused. He tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Why is the soldier lady in trouble?" he asked. The woman glanced at Daniela, her eyes flickered, then dropped, and without a word, she pulled her son along, walking faster. That was the part that cut deeper than the cuffs. When they tried to force her into the back seat, she didn't resist. But she spoke. "Let me make one phone call," she said. Calm. Clear. A soldier's tone, precise, measured. The sergeant laughed. "This ain't a courtesy call, sweetheart. You can talk all you want at the station." "I'm not asking," Daniela replied. "Just give me 60 seconds. Yeah? You think one little phone call is gonna undo this?" "No," she said, looking him dead in the eye. "But it's gonna make you regret not letting me." They ignored her. Ran her license. Ran her ID. Held it up to the light. Turned it over. Whispered among themselves. Suspicion lingered. "Looks fake," the older officer muttered. "Too clean. Like it was printed yesterday." The younger cop hesitated. "Or, maybe it's real. We could call it and verify it." But that was met with a glare from the sergeant, who responded, "Or maybe we just bring her in and let the big boys sort it out." Inside the patrol car, the air was heavy with recycled heat and tension. Her hands throbbed from the cuffs. The officer beside her kept his hand near his holster, as if she might suddenly shape-shift into a threat. The irony made her want to laugh. 8 years of defending a country that wouldn't defend her dignity on a sidewalk. The car started moving. Slowly. She could see the crowd thinning, people moving on, the way people always do. Injustice had a short shelf life in the public eye. But Daniela wasn't built for noise. She was built for stillness. For waiting. And she knew, without a doubt, that the moment she made that call, everything would change. "You don't have to believe me," she said softly, her eyes never leaving the mirror where the sergeant's gaze flickered. "You don't even have to respect me. But when you dial this number," she paused, pressing her cuffed hands together in her lap, "you'll want to pretend this moment never." The phone sat on the edge of the desk, taunting her like a lifeline dipped in arrogance. The officer tossed it in front of her as if he were doing her a favor. "One call," he said, his voice thick with contempt. "Make it count. Let's see who comes running." He leaned back, arms crossed, a smug grin playing at the corner of his mouth. This wasn't generosity. This was theater. A show of control. He wanted her to beg. Daniela didn't. She picked up the receiver with steady hands, even though her wrist still bore the red marks of the cuffs, even though her jaw was clenched tight enough to ache. She dialed the number from memory. It rang once. Then silence. Then a voice, calm and clipped. "Briggs." That was all he said. One word. No question. No hello. "It's me," Daniela answered. "Situation developing. Civilian hold. I'm at Central Precinct, downtown." Misidentification. A pause. Then, understood. And the line went dead. She set the phone down and met the officer's smirk with nothing but stillness. "That's it?" he asked. "No lawyer? No tears? Just a mystery man named Briggs." She didn't answer. He waved her off with a chuckle and walked away. 10 minutes passed. Maybe less. Long enough for boredom to settle. Long enough for the officer to forget the way she had said his name like a code word. Then the station phone rang. Once. Then again. And again. Until every desk in the room had a blinking red light. Dispatch phones. Command lines. Even the emergency override line. The sergeant picked up one, barked out his name, then fell silent. He picked up another, but his posture shifted, spine straightening as if gravity had just remembered who he was. Voices got quieter. People started pacing. Daniela sat in the holding area, still uncuffed now, still silent, watching the unease unravel. It wasn't the calls that caused the shift. It was the way those calls were answered. "Yes, sir. I understand, sir. She's here. No, we didn't. Yes, I'll comply. And then, just when the tension had reached the point of snapping, tires crunched outside. A vehicle stopped. Not a police cruiser. Not a lawyer's sedan. No, it was matte black. Government issued. Military grade. The kind that didn't show up without a reason. The door opened, and out stepped a man in dress uniform, bars shining across his chest, the silver eagle on his shoulders catching the sun. He didn't knock. He didn't ask. He walked straight through the precinct doors like the building owed him gravity. Who's in charge here? He asked. The question was rhetorical. No one moved. He pointed at Daniela without looking. That woman you detained. Her name is Lieutenant Commander Daniela Rios. Former Deputy Commander of Bravo 4, Naval Special Operations. Highest commendations. Classified operations clearance. The fact that she's in this building is a mistake someone will answer for. The silence was surgical. Sliced through the air and left nothing but breathless stares. The smirking officer from before had gone pale. His hands were now gripping the edge of the desk as if the floor had started to tilt. He opened his mouth, maybe to defend himself, maybe to apologize, but nothing came out. The man Briggs turned to Daniela. Are you injured? She shook her head. He nodded once. You're free to go. And just like that, the balance of power snapped. The room that had swallowed her whole hours earlier now couldn't meet her eyes. One officer started to speak, to offer some weak explanation, but Briggs cut him off without looking. Save it. She won't need an apology from you. But someone in your chain of command will be rewriting protocols by morning. Daniela stood slowly. Not triumphant. Not smug. Just steady. She glanced at the officer who had handed her the phone. His arms now hung limp at his sides. He looked like a man realizing, too late, that the rules were bigger than his ego. She didn't gloat. She didn't speak. She just walked past them all, still in the same jacket, the same pin, the same quiet pride, and as she passed the threshold into sunlight, she didn't look back. Because she didn't need to. She was no longer just a veteran. No longer just a name on a list. She was proof. Proof that dignity doesn't raise its voice. Proof that sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the room is the person who says nothing until the world listens. The sun hadn't moved much since she was dragged out of the crowd, but everything else had. Daniela now stood in the precinct's front lobby, her hands free, her jacket brushed clean by her own fingertips, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she was taught to leave a place better than she found it, even when that place had tried to humiliate her. The tension still lingered like smoke after a fire. The officers who'd cuffed her now hovered in the corners, looking anywhere but at her. The younger female cop leaned against a wall, arms folded, eyes red like she hadn't blinked since the moment Briggs walked in. A few civilian bystanders remained just outside the glass doors, their phones still pointed toward the building, still recording, still trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Inside, silence weighed heavier than any accusation ever had. Briggs broke it. Not with volume, but authority. 2 years ago, he said, his voice filling the space like steel through fog, Lieutenant Commander Rios led an international extraction operation in Eastern Europe. Hostage rescue. High risk. Classified. She coordinated 12 men in hostile territory with 0 casualties. Not only did she bring everyone home, she did it without setting off a single alert. NATO gave her commendation. Our government sealed it. He turned to the officers. Which is why her name doesn't show up when you punch it into your patrol car's cheap laptop. Nobody spoke. Not even the ones who thought they might try. She didn't tell you any of that, he continued. Because real service doesn't need to be explained to people looking to disrespect it. She didn't mention her rank, or her record, or the 2 bullets pulled from her shoulder in Kandahar. Because she never had to. He paused, then added, more sharply, until now. The precinct captain, a man who'd been watching from his office window until it was no longer safe to pretend he hadn't, finally stepped forward. His face was red not from shame, but from exposure. Exposure to his own lack of control. Miss Rios, he said, choking slightly on the words, I'd like to personally apologize. No, Briggs cut him off. You'll do it outside. In front of them. He gestured toward the glass, toward the citizens still watching, toward the ones who now had the truth, but needed to see it confirmed from the same mouths that once mocked it. The captain's lips tightened. He hesitated, then walked out the doors with the stiffness of someone forced to confront their reflection. Daniela followed, not because she was commanded to, but because she wanted to look this moment in the eye. And when the captain faced the cameras and mumbled through a weak apology about procedural misunderstanding, she didn't flinch. She didn't thank him. She didn't excuse him. She just stood still, her chin raised, her silence louder than anything he said. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Is it true? Are you really military?" She turned toward them, met their gaze, and nodded once. Calm. Steady. Then, from behind her, the officer who had first cuffed her took a step forward, awkward, uncertain. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, then looked down, then back up. He opened his mouth as if to explain, or justify, or ask for forgiveness. But she spoke first. "I don't need your apology," she said, her voice low and level. "I need you to remember this. The next time you stop someone who doesn't look like you. The next time your gut tells you to treat them like a threat before you treat them like a person." He nodded. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the only thing left he could do. Then came the younger female officer, the one who had hesitated, who had wanted to speak up and didn't. Her eyes shimmered as she stepped closer, voice trembling. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have said something sooner." Daniela looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, not with contempt, but with the measured gaze of someone who's been waiting for someone to grow a spine. "Next time," she said, "don't wait for permission." And in that moment, everything shifted again. Not because the apology fixed the damage, not because justice had suddenly blossomed from thin air, but because the woman who had been paraded in front of a crowd like a criminal now stood before them as something they hadn't seen coming, a symbol, not of power, not of revenge, but of restraint. "I forgive you," she said finally, her words slow and exact, "but I won't forget." And she meant it, because her forgiveness wasn't a gift. It was a line drawn in the sand, a reminder that dignity, once bruised, doesn't vanish, it learns how to stand taller. The cameras kept rolling, but now they were pointed at a different kind of story. Not the takedown of a threat, but the quiet redemption of a country forced to look at itself and bow its head. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the footage had been seen by over 5 million people. What started as a 47-second clip of a brown-skinned woman being cuffed outside a department store had turned into a 3-hour loop dissected by news anchors, TikTok activists, former military brass, and civilians who suddenly found themselves asking questions they never bothered to ask before. Her name, Daniela Rios, was now spoken with reverence or rage, depending on who held the mic. But she wasn't reading the comments. She wasn't watching the coverage. She had learned long ago that real strength didn't live in the noise, but in what you did when no one was clapping. 2 officers from the precinct were immediately placed under internal review. Official statements used words like misconduct, failure to de-escalate, and racially motivated assumptions. But behind those lines were deeper truths, ones the department wasn't ready to say out loud. The female officer, the one who had hesitated, the one whose eyes had filled with something close to shame when it was all unraveling, handed in her resignation quietly that same week. No press. No interviews. Just a handwritten letter left on her superior's desk, and an envelope with no return address slipped into Daniela's mailbox. Inside, a single sentence. "Next time, I'll speak sooner." Daniela didn't respond. She didn't need to. Some messages are best left resting in forgiveness. When the major network reached out for an exclusive, she said no. But when a local community channel, small studio, no commercial break agenda, asked if she would speak to young women watching, she said yes. She sat in front of their worn couch, camera slightly tilted, no makeup, no prep, and when the interviewer asked what she wanted people to understand, Daniela didn't clear her throat or adjust her tone. She looked straight at the lens and said, "I don't speak for a party. I don't speak for a side. I speak because I was silenced. And I want people who look like me to know they don't have to stay quiet when they're being erased." That clip went viral too. But not because it was dramatic. Because it was true. Letters started pouring in. Not from politicians or celebrities, but from women in uniform. Some old. Some active duty. Some long retired, but still carrying invisible wounds. One wrote, "They took my voice in 1989. You just gave it back." Another, "I kept my medals in a drawer because I didn't think they mattered. After watching you, I put them on my mantle." Daniela read each one. Slowly. Like a prayer. She didn't reply to all of them. She didn't need to. Just knowing they were written was enough. When she returned to her civilian job, people no longer passed her in hallways like she was background noise. Now they paused. Now they nodded. Now they looked her in the eyes. She didn't ask for that shift. She didn't need their respect to validate who she was. But she did notice the way they treated her no longer as a checkbox in a diversity spreadsheet, but as a presence. As a leader without the badge. Without the title. Just by being. The mayor's office extended an invitation. Advisory role. Civilian Oversight Board. Help us fix the system that nearly broke you. She turned it down. Politely. Firmly. I didn't survive this to become a symbol, she said. I just want to live. And make space for others to live with dignity, too. She knew the system needed changing. But she also knew that some revolutions start quietly, at grocery store lines, at parent-teacher meetings, at morning coffee stands, where assumptions are challenged not with speeches, but with presence. Justice, she believed, didn't need to shout. It needed to endure. And she was still here. Still walking the same streets where she'd been humiliated. Still holding her head high. Not because people were watching now, but because she knew what it cost to walk with purpose when no one had your back. She didn't want a parade. She didn't want a headline. She wanted what every soldier wants when the mission ends, peace. And maybe, just maybe, the kind of silence that no longer had to be survived. It was a quiet afternoon on the south end of the city, the kind of day where the breeze smells faintly of warm asphalt and grocery store parking lots, where life moves slowly enough to notice things you usually ignore. Daniela was exiting a small neighborhood food co-op, a reusable bag over one shoulder, a soft hum in her throat from the music playing through her earbuds. She didn't see him at first, not until the movement caught the corner of her eye. A figure hunched near the exit, hoodie pulled low, hands tucked into the sleeves not for cold, but for something deeper, shame, maybe. He was sitting on the concrete with the posture of someone who had once stood straighter, someone who had once been in control. When he looked up, their eyes met. He recognized her immediately. She saw it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way he quickly turned his face away like a child caught doing something wrong. It was the officer who had once cuffed her, once looked at her like she was less than. Now, he was wearing the uniform of the forgotten, threadbare jeans, a sunburned neck, the emptiness of someone who had lost more than a job. He didn't expect her to come closer. But she did. Slowly. Intentionally. Without malice. She didn't ask what had happened, she already knew. The headlines had faded, but the consequences had not. He'd been let go during the investigation, blacklisted from similar roles, moved through part-time shifts until they dried up. The world had shifted under his feet the way it had once shifted under hers. Daniela reached into her bag and pulled out a paper sack filled with fruit, canned goods, a sandwich. She knelt, handed it to him gently, as if handing back something that had once been taken. I'm not carrying hate, she said, soft but clear. I never was. He looked at her, blinking hard. His voice cracked on the first word. I was wrong. He swallowed, tried again. I was wrong from the moment I didn't see you as a person. His hands trembled as he took the food. Not from hunger. From the unbearable weight of being seen. She didn't scold. She didn't preach. She just looked at him the way he hadn't looked at her that day, like a human being. Now you do, she said. Lie better. She stood and walked away, the moment folding behind her like a page turned without noise. No one filmed it. No one clapped. And that made it real. Months later, she stood in front of a classroom full of high schoolers, kids too young to vote, but old enough to feel the world pressing on them already. She was teaching a workshop on human rights, invited by a friend, reluctant at first. But then someone asked her what it meant to be brave. And for the first time, she told the story. Not the viral version. Not the headlines. The real version. The feelings. The waiting. The choice to remain calm when rage would have been justified. The silence that cost more than words. She didn't show them footage. She didn't pass out links. She just spoke. And they listened. Not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't have to. The sun was setting when she walked out of the school that day. A soft breeze rustled the flag outside, lifting it gently into the glow of the horizon. Daniela paused for a moment, watching it sway. Not with pride. Not with bitterness. But with peace. Because justice hadn't come with sirens. It had come with stillness. And healing. And the choice to be more than the pain others tried to put on her. Some stories don't end with victory. They end with understanding. And sometimes, that's enough. If the story moved you, even just a little, share it with someone who needs to remember what quiet strength looks like. Subscribe to Cracks of Light and stay with us for more stories that remind the world it's not always about who shouts loudest, but who refuses to be broken.